Welcome back to DFC Books. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into Viktor Frankl's, his seminal work, Man's Search for Meaning. And this really isn't just a book, is it? It's like an artifact of history, of philosophy.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Written by someone who lived through the unimaginable horrors of Auschwitz and Dachau.
Mhm.
And it's truly extraordinary when you think about how it was written. Frankel drafted the original manuscript, basically anonymously, in just 9 straight days back in 1945.
9 days.
Yeah. And his goal, he said, was purely to show, using the most concrete and painful examples possible, that life always holds potential meaning under any conditions.
And demonstrating that's really our mission for this deep dive. We want to unpack those terrifying experiences from part one, the people he describes, the psychological phases of survival,
Right.
and then connect that directly to the therapeutic ideas that came out of it, logotherapy, which is part two. So the goal for you listening is to really grasp Frankel's core idea that our main drive as humans is this quest for meaning.
And to really get the book, I think you first have to understand the person behind it, Viktor E. Frankl. He was already a prominent neurologist and psychiatrist in Vienna before the war.
Right, he wasn't just some random observer.
No, not at all. And he went on to found what's known as the Third Viennese School of Psychotherapy.
That context is so important because most people know the first school, Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, which focused on the will to pleasure.
Correct.
And then the second school, Alfred Adler's individual psychology, which is more about the striving for the will to power.
But Frankl looked at both and said, essentially, they're incomplete. His school, logotherapy, which comes from the Greek word logos, meaning meaning, argues that the primary human motivation is the will to meaning.
And he saw this confirmed in the camps, didn't he?
He absolutely did. He observed that when people were stripped of everything, literally everything, pleasure, power, belongings, what determined survival, at least spiritual survival, was clinging to some higher purpose.
That conviction, forged in that absolute hell, really comes through in that Nietzsche quote he uses all the time. He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow.
Exactly. And that's not just, a nice self-help phrase. It's a foundation for survival built from the experience of extreme suffering.
Yeah, it gives it immense weight.
It really does. And philosophy, that lived philosophy, takes us straight into the heart of part one of the book. Frankl wasn't just prisoner number 119,104.
Which is staggering in itself.
It is. But his training allowed him to maintain this almost clinical detachment, observing the psychological shifts in himself and, importantly, in others around him.
It's such a strange duality, isn't it? He's right there, suffering the same things, but also somehow observing it all, recording it mentally.
Precisely. And for most of his time there, he wasn't acting as a psychiatrist, not until the very end anyway. He was just an ordinary laborer, digging ditches, laying railway tracks.
So what kept him going initially?
Well, his initial motivation on a purely human level was twofold. Deeply personal, but also universal in a way. First, the hope of seeing his wife again.
Of course.
And second, this professional ambition, this idea that after the war, he could lecture about the very psychology he was witnessing and experiencing. That future goal was his anchor.
Let's talk about the different types of people Frankl describes, because the camps acted like this intense filter, didn't they? Bringing out the absolute best and the absolute worst.
Definitely. And we have to start with perhaps the most reviled group, the capos.
These were prisoners too, right? But put in charge.
Yes, prisoners chosen by the SS to be trustees, basically overseeing fellow inmates. And Frankl is very clear. The selection process for capos was, in his words, a negative one. They weren't picked for wisdom or kindness.
No, quite the opposite.
Often the most brutal, most morally compromised individuals were chosen.
And they frequently ended up being even harsher than the SS guards themselves.
Absolutely. It's a chilling psychological observation. They often mirrored their oppressors, adopting that ruthless mindset to justify their own, small privileges, a bit more food, maybe cigarettes, lighter work. Survival for them depended on sustained cruelty. It shows the terrible compromises involved.
Then there's the other end of the spectrum, the profoundly tragic group Frankl mentions, the ones who had just given up hope. The prisoners called them the Muslims.
Yes, the Muslims. These were the prisoners who were emaciated, sick, completely demoralized. They'd lost all sense of meaning, all hope. You could often tell when someone reached that point. Maybe they refused to get up, or they'd smoked their last hidden cigarette, a sign they'd given up on the future.
And these were the ones targeted in the selections.
Inevitably. They were the first victims. They had succumbed to that existential vacuum before their physical death. And Frankl makes this devastating observation. He says the reason he survived to write the book is because, quote, the best of us did not return.
Meaning the most morally upright, the kindest.
Often, yes. Those with the deepest inner core perhaps lacked the sheer ruthlessness required for physical survival in those conditions. It highlights the awful moral cost of just staying alive.
Which makes the existence of that fourth group he talks about, the rare saints, even more striking.
These were, the spiritual giants, the very few who somehow maintained their humanity, comforting others, sharing their tiny ration of bread, offering a kind word when it cost them everything.
And for Frankl, these examples were crucial.
Absolutely crucial. Yeah. He says even one such example is sufficient proof that our inner strength, our moral freedom, can actually rise above our outward fate. These individuals prove that the camps couldn't strip away that final freedom, the freedom to choose your attitude.
Okay, so let's move into the experience itself, the psychological phases Frankl outlines, starting with phase 1, shock. This hits right from the transport journey, doesn't it?
It does. The brutality is almost impossible to grasp now. 1,500 people crammed into cattle cars, maybe 80 to a coach, for days. And they believed they were just going to a labor camp.
So there was this initial, almost denial.
Frankl calls it the delusion of reprieve, this desperate clinging to optimism, thinking, it can't really be that bad. Even seeing the sign Auschwitz, he says, didn't immediately shatter that hope for everyone.
But that delusion was shattered instantly by the selection. You called it the single most important event of this first phase. Frankl's term was chilling, the finger game.
Yeah. It was horrifyingly bureaucratic, casual, prisoners shuffling past an SS officer, often looking immaculate, bored even, who just pointed left or right.
Right meant work, survival. Left meant...
Left meant the gas chambers, immediate death. Frankl remembers that moment vividly, the sudden panic, trying to stand straight, look fit. He got sent right. But he found out later that about 90% of his transport went left.
And the reality of left became clear immediately.
Painfully clear. He asked another prisoner about his friend P who had gone left, and the prisoner just pointed towards a column of smoke rising in the distance.
Oh, my God.
Rising in these gray, sinister clouds, and said, that's where your friend is, floating up to heaven.
That's the moment, the absolute break with reality.
That's it. All former life extinguished. And the dehumanization just accelerated from there. At the cleansing station, everything was taken. Possessions, clothes, hair shaved head to toe. Every scrap of identity. Just naked existence remained.
And for Frankl personally, the most gut-wrenching loss was his manuscript.
Yeah, his scientific book, his life's work on logotherapy, he was desperately trying to hide this roll of paper in his coat pocket, hoping, somehow, he showed it to an older prisoner, asking for advice. What could he do?
And the response?
The older prisoner just looked at it, looked at Frankl, and dismissed it with one single devastating word that summed up the entire camp reality. Shit.
Wow. It says everything. The total irrelevance of the past.
Exactly. Frankl writes that this was the moment he consciously struck out his whole former life. He knew all those connections were severed. But interestingly, he says this shock didn't lead to immediate breakdown. It shifted into this strange state. A grim sense of humor, he calls it, and a cold curiosity.
Detachment as a survival mechanism.
Absolutely. The mind protecting itself, which leads directly into phase 2, apathy. The necessary emotional death.
Necessary, but horrifying.
Essential for survival, he argues. It was this required blunting of emotions. Disgust, horror, pity. They just became deadened. You couldn't afford to feel them constantly. The prisoner's inner life became incredibly primitive, focused almost entirely on survival mechanics, calories.
And he gives some really graphic, unforgettable examples of this apathy taking hold.
He does. The one that always sticks with me is the story from the sickbay. He describes watching, completely unmoved, as a 12-year-old boy with frostbitten, gangrenous toes had the dead black tissue picked off with tweezers.
Just watched as a doctor.
As a fellow prisoner, a numb observer. The man of science in him noted the clinical details, but the human response of pity or horror, it was just gone. Exhausted, worn away by the daily onslaught.
And this apathy extended to how they treated the dead, didn't it?
Yes, the dead became resources. He talks about watching fellow prisoners immediately descend on a newly dead body, stripping it of anything useful, scraps of food hidden away, shoes, even bits of string.
And Frankl himself.
He recounts sipping his watery daily soup, completely unbothered, while a corpse's head was literally rattling on the steps of the hut next to him, staring in the window. It's a chilling detail showing just how profound that necessary emotional shutdown was.
He makes a really important distinction, though. He says the physical pain, the beatings, wasn't the worst part.
Right. That's crucial. The beatings were terrible, obviously. But he says the greater suffering came from the mental agony, the injustice, the unreasonableness of it all. The feeling of being treated not just cruelly, but irrationally. That was soul-destroying.
And you see that sense of injustice kind of flare up in him during the Foreman incident.
Yes. When he's exhausted from digging, and this particularly nasty foreman Frank's description is vivid, he calls him a pig's head, starts shouting at him, insulting him. Where were you, swine? A businessman?
And Frankel snaps back.
For a moment, yes. His dignity just flares. He risks a beating, straightens up, and declares, I was a doctor, a specialist. It was this tiny act of asserting his lost identity, his value. A stand against being totally dehumanized.
He was lucky, though.
Incredibly lucky. A Candier Capo intervened someone Frankel had actually helped with some sort of psychotherapy earlier and got him moved to a slightly less brutal work detail. Pure chance, really.
And throughout this phase, you see the overwhelming dominance of just basic primitive needs, like dreams about food.
Constantly. Food became the absolute center of existence. They'd have these endless, intense debates about the sense or nonsense of eating their tiny bread ration all at once versus saving bits for later. It symbolized that struggle between immediate impulse and any kind of future planning.
And he notes something interesting physiologically, too, about the lack of sexual urge.
Yes. Due to the extreme chronic undernourishment, he says, the sexual urge practically disappeared. A regression that was quite different from what you might see in other all-male institutions like barracks or prisons.
The utter lack of sentimentality or empathy that came with this apathy is really stark in the story about the train passing through Vienna.
Oh, that's a painful one. He's on a transport, heading towards Dachau, and he realizes the train is going right past his old street in Vienna. He begs the younger, more hardened prisoners who are crowded around the people in the cattle car.
Just for a glimpse.
Just one look at his home, and they refuse him. Just completely cynical and rude about it. You lived here all those years.
Yeah.
Well, then you have seen quite enough already.
Ugh. It just shows the total shutdown of normal human feeling. Just self-preservation.
Exactly. Pure focus on the self. But paradoxically, this depth of despair is what sets the stage for Phase 3, the discovery of spiritual freedom. Frankel noticed something interesting here.
What was that?
He observed that while sensitive people often suffered more physically initially, their richer inner life actually protected their core self more. They had somewhere internal to retreat to.
And that retreat led to perhaps the most profound insight in the whole book, the power of love.
Absolutely. It happened during one of those hideous freezing marches to a work site. He's stumbling, numb with cold, feet aching, and suddenly his mind just retreats completely into the image of his wife.
He starts talking to her in his head.
Yes, having conversations, seeing her smile, feeling her presence so intensely. And he has this huge realization. The salvation of man is through love and in love. He understood that love transcends the physical person, transcends even life or death.
So it didn't matter if she was actually alive or dead at that moment?
No. The love itself was real, an internal reality, a source of immense strength. Love is as strong as death, he concludes. It was proof of that ultimate inner freedom that couldn't be touched by the SS.
And this inner richness wasn't just about human love. It extended to moments of appreciating beauty, too.
Yes, finding these tiny, fleeting moments of intense beauty, almost bliss amidst the squalor. Watching a sunset through the bars of the hut window, seeing the way the light caught the mud puddles outside. He quotes a fellow prisoner whispering, "How beautiful the world could be."
Small moments of transcendence.
Exactly. Little acts of self-detachment. Even their attempts at humor, the grim jokes, the improvised cabaret shows they sometimes put on it, all serve that purpose.
Yeah.
Detaching the self, momentarily, from the overwhelming suffering.
But the absolutely critical element for survival in this third phase you mentioned was holding on to a future goal. Really living that Nietzsche quote.
Yes, this was psychologically vital.
Yeah.
Frankel became convinced. The prisoner who had lost faith in the future, his future was doomed. Life in the camp was this provisional existence of unknown limit, he said. It warped time. The past felt unreal. Tiny present sufferings felt endless. Without a future goal, you just collapsed inwardly.
And he saw the fatal consequences of losing that goal, like in the case of his friend F, the composer.
Right. F had this dream, a voice telling him he'd be liberated by March 30th. He clung to this date. But as it got closer, the war news was bad. There was no sign of liberation.
And his hope just died.
It seemed to. He suddenly fell ill with typhus. His resistance plummeted, and he died on March 31st. Frankl believed the profound disappointment, the loss of that future anchor, essentially killed him. His body gave up when his hope did.
But Frankl developed a technique to combat this despair in himself, right? This self-transcendence.
He did. Instead of getting bogged down in the immediate misery, the cold, the hunger, the insults, he would force his mind to imagine himself somewhere else entirely, standing in a warm, well-lit lecture hall after the war.
Lecturing about this very experience.
Exactly. Lecturing on the psychology of the concentration camp. By objectifying his suffering, turning it into scientific data for a future purpose, he could rise above it mentally. He quotes Spinoza. Emotion, which is suffering, ceases to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture of it.
And this assertion of inner freedom culminates in that incredibly difficult decision he had to make near the end, the choice to stay or escape.
A profound moment of moral clarity. He had a genuine chance to escape. A friend had got hold of uniforms. They could try to slip out.
But he was responsible for patients.
Yes, he was looking after a hut full of typhus patients, some near death, including a countryman of his. The escape was risky, but staying was arguably even riskier with the camp in chaos. He consciously chose to stay, to fulfill his responsibility to his patients.
And what did that choice feel like?
Immediately, he says, the horrible tension and anxiety he'd been feeling just vanished, replaced by an inward peace. He hadn't passively accepted fate. He'd actively chosen his duty, taken fate into his own hands, even if it meant death.
And the irony, the twist of fate that followed is just unbelievable.
Astonishing. That choice saved his life. The transport that left that night, the one he'd avoided, the one they thought was going to a safe rest camp, was diverted. The prisoners were locked in huts at another site and burned alive. Frankl remained, was eventually liberated. His choice of responsibility led directly to his survival.
Wow. These experiences, they form such a powerful, undeniable foundation for the therapy he developed later. Which brings us to part 2, logotherapy.
Exactly. Logotherapy, meaning meaning-centered psychotherapy, is Frankl's great contribution, built directly on these lessons. And as we touched on, it's fundamentally different from the schools that came before it.
Right. Freud looked back. Adler looked inward.
Logotherapy looks forward. It's perspective. It focuses on the meanings out there in the future that the patient needs to find and fulfill.
And this is based on that core idea, the will to meaning.
Correct. Frankl was adamant. The search for purpose isn't some secondary thing, some rationalization like critics claimed. It's our primary, innate motivation. He'd point to surveys, like one showing 78% of students rating finding a purpose and meaning as more important than making a lot of money. It's a genuine human drive.
So if that drive, that will to meaning, gets blocked or frustrated, what happens then?
That leads to what Frankl called existential frustration. And this frustration isn't primarily psychological in the Freudian sense. It's rooted in the pneutological dimension from the Greek word nous, meaning mind or spirit. It's a spiritual or meaning-based frustration.
And this can actually cause neurosis, noogenic neurosis.
Yes, neuroses that stem not from inner conflicts about drives, but from this deeper emptiness, this lack of meaning in life.
And Frankl had this really interesting take on mental health itself, didn't he? This idea of noodynamics. He argued against just seeking a tension-free state.
Absolutely. He believed mental health requires a certain amount of tension, the noodynamics.
Yeah.
This is the healthy tension between what you are now and what you feel you ought to become, or the meaning you are striving to fulfill.
Like stretching towards something.
Exactly. He used an architectural analogy. You don't strengthen a weak arch by taking weight off it. You strengthen it by increasing the load, making it hold together better. We need that striving toward a worthwhile goal. It creates essential, healthy tension.
And if that tension is lost, if there's no goal, no meaning pulling you forward, that's when people fall into existential vacuum.
That's his term for the widespread problem he saw emerging in the 20th century, and arguably even more so now. This feeling of inner emptiness, meaninglessness. He thought it came from a kind of double loss.
What were those losses?
First, as humans, we've lost many of the basic animal instincts that used to securely guide behavior. And second, the traditions that used to structure our lives and tell us what we should value have crumbled for many people.
So without instinct telling you what you must do and tradition telling you what you ought to do, you're kind of lost.
You are. And Frankl saw two main unhealthy responses. Either conformism, you just do what everyone else is doing, or totalitarianism, you just do what powerful figures tell you to do. Both are ways of avoiding the freedom and responsibility of finding your own meaning.
And this vacuum shows up in everyday life.
Clearly, he thought. In widespread boredom, especially what he called Sunday neurosis, the depression that hits when the busy weekends and the inner emptiness becomes apparent. And it fuels addictions, aggression, depression, people trying to fill the void.
It sounds like he's suggesting that when the will to meaning is frustrated, people often overcompensate by chasing pleasure or power even harder.
That's exactly it. The frustrated will to meaning gets channeled, often desperately, into seeking pleasure, maybe through frantic sexual activity or addictions or grasping for power, trying to fill that spiritual hole with external validation. So the real cure has to address that root lack of purpose.
Okay, so if a patient comes to a logotherapist and asks, the big question, what is the meaning of my life? How does the therapist respond? Frankel says they can't just give an answer, right?
No, because meaning isn't generic. It's unique to each person and changes from moment to moment. Frankl actually flips the question. He says, it's not about what you expect from life. It's about realizing that life is constantly asking things of you. Life poses the questions.
And our job is to answer through our actions.
Through our responsibleness, that's the core of existence for Frankl. We're responsible for answering life's questions. This leads to his version of a categorical imperative.
Which,
Live as if you were living already for the second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you're about to act now.
wow, okay. That forces you to think about the consequences, the finality of your choices right now.
Exactly. It heightens that sense of responsibility for making the most of each moment, for choosing meaningfully.
So the therapist isn't painting the meaning onto the patient's life.
No, more like an eye doctor, helping the patient see clearly the whole spectrum of potential meanings that are already out there, waiting to be actualized. And seeing those meanings requires what Frankl called self-transcendence.
Meaning looking beyond yourself.
Yes. Being truly human, for Frankl, means always being directed towards something or someone other than oneself, whether it's a cause to serve, a meaning to fulfill, or another person to love. And crucially, he insisted self-actualization isn't the goal itself.
It's a byproduct.
It's a side effect. It happens automatically when you forget yourself in pursuit of a higher meaning or in loving someone else.
Yeah.
If you aim directly for self-actualization, you'll miss it.
Okay, so how do we discover these meanings? Frankl outlines three main paths. The first is pretty straightforward. Creating something, doing a deed, work.
Right. Achieving something through your actions or creations. That's one way. The second path is through experience.
Experiencing what?
Goodness, truth, beauty, maybe connecting deeply with nature. Or, and this is huge for Frankl, encountering another human being through love. He saw love as the only way to truly grasp the unique core of another person.
So loving someone helps them realize their potential.
Yes. By loving them, you see their potential, and in a way, you help them actualize it. For Frankl, love wasn't just some side effect of hormones. It was a primary meaning-creating act.
Okay, work and love experience. What's the third way? This seems like the one most clearly forged in the camps.
It is. Finding meaning through your attitude toward unavoidable suffering. When you are faced with a situation you absolutely cannot change, like a terminal illness or being in Auschwitz, you still have one freedom left.
The freedom to choose how you respond.
Exactly. The freedom to choose your attitude towards that suffering. That's the ultimate human freedom, and it can turn tragedy into a triumph internally.
Let's revisit that example of the grieving doctor. It illustrates this so perfectly.
Right. The elderly doctor, deeply depressed after his wife died, couldn't get over his grief. Frankl didn't try to minimize his pain. Instead, he asked him gently, "Doctor, what would have happened if you had died first and your wife had had to mourn you?"
And the doctor was horrified at the thought of her suffering.
Yes. He said it would have been terrible for her. And Frankl then pointed out, "You see, doctor, such suffering has been spared her, and it is you who have spared her this suffering. But now you have to pay the price by surviving and mourning her."
Instantly, the suffering wasn't just meaningless pain anymore.
It took on meaning. The meaning of a sacrifice made out of love. Frankl argues we are ready to bear almost any suffering if it has a meaning. But he's very clear. This only applies to unavoidable suffering. Suffering for its own sake is just masochism.
Okay. Now, Frankl also developed a specific technique for dealing with certain types of neuroses, especially those driven by anxiety. Paradoxical intention.
Yes, this is quite a clever technique. It's based on two common observations. First, fear often brings about the very thing we're afraid of. He called this anticipatory anxiety, like being so afraid you'll blush that you actually do blush.
Right.
And second, trying too hard to force something to happen often prevents it hyperintention, like trying desperately to fall asleep, which just keeps you awake. patients get stuck in these vicious cycles.
So how does paradoxical intention break the cycle?
It's counterintuitive. The therapist encourages the patient to actually try to do the very thing they fear, or to exaggerate the symptoms.
Seriously, like if you're afraid of sweating in public, you should try to sweat.
Exactly. Frankel gives the example of telling a man with this fear to deliberately try and show people how much he could sweat, maybe aiming for quarts, or telling someone with writer's cramp to try and produce the messiest, most illegible scrawl imaginable.
How does that possibly help?
By intending the symptom, often with humor, you take the wind out of the sails of the anticipatory anxiety. You're no longer fighting it, you're paradoxically inviting it. This uses our uniquely human capacity for self-detachment, for humor. You short-circuit the fear feedback loop. The patient realizes they can control it, in a way, which reduces the fear that caused it.
That's fascinating. It all ties back to this idea of inner freedom and choice, which leads us nicely into the final part of his argument, the postscript on tragic optimism. This feels like where he brings everything together to face life's hardest realities.
It really is. Tragic optimism is about saying yes to life, finding meaning and hope, despite what he calls the tragic triad:
Which are?
pain or suffering, guilt, and death, or the transitoriness of life. These are unavoidable parts of the human condition. Tragic optimism isn't about pretending they don't exist. It's about finding meaning in them or despite them, primarily through our attitude.
We've talked a lot about turning suffering into achievement through attitude. He gives another powerful example with Jerry Long, right?
Yes, a more contemporary example. Jerry Long became a quadriplegic after an accident, paralyzed from the neck down. But he wrote about finding meaning in his condition. He famously said, "I broke my neck, it didn't break me."
How did he find meaning?
By realizing his situation gave him a unique ability to help and inspire others facing similar challenges. Frankel's point is clear. Long didn't choose the accident, but he absolutely chose his response, his attitude. And that choice transformed his reality.
Okay, so that's pain suffering. What about guilt, the second part of the triad? We usually see guilt as purely negative.
Frankel reframes it. He sees guilt as a potential catalyst, an opportunity for change. Real guilt over past wrongdoings invites us to become a better person, to take responsibility and grow beyond those mistakes.
And he uses the story of Dr. J, the mass murderer of Steinhoff.
Yes, a complex and frankly notorious figure from a psychiatric institution who had been involved in the Nazi euthanasia program. A man responsible for terrible things.
But his story didn't end there.
No. Later, Dr. J ended up imprisoned himself in a Russian POW camp. And according to Frankel's account, in that prison, Dr. J underwent a profound transformation. He became known as the best comrade, living up to the absolute highest moral standards, caring for others, before dying of cancer himself.
So for Frankel, this proved.
It proved that no one is beyond redemption, that humans are ultimately self-determining. We retain the freedom to change ourselves at any moment. Past behavior doesn't lock us in forever.
Okay, and the final part of the tragic triad, death. The fact that life is transitory.
This is where Frankel offers such a beautiful perspective shift. Instead of seeing the transitoriness of life as a reason for despair, he sees it as an urgent call to responsibility. Because each moment passes and cannot be retrieved, we have a duty to fill it meaningfully.
And the past isn't lost.
Not at all. He argues that once our deeds are done, our experiences lived, our sufferings bravely borne, they are not gone. They are irrevocably stored and treasured in the past. Having been, he says, is the surest kind of being.
So old age isn't emptiness, it's a full granary.
Exactly. He says we should envy older people, not pity them. They have a rich storehouse of harvested realities, fulfilled meanings, acts of love and courage. Their past is full, not empty.
This whole framework, logotherapy, tragic optimism, it really stands as a powerful argument against the idea that we're just products of our environment, totally conditioned. Pan-determinism, he called it.
Fiercely against it. And Frankel felt uniquely positioned to argue this, being a neurologist, a psychiatrist, and a survivor of 4 camps. He directly refuted Freud's prediction that under extreme conditions like starvation, all individual differences would vanish, leaving only primal drives.
But that's not what he saw in Auschwitz.
He saw the exact opposite. He states forcefully that the camps didn't make people uniform. They made people more different. The pressure polarized humanity. The swine became swinier, but the saints became saintlier. Circumstances didn't erase choice, they revealed it more starkly.
Revealing that fundamental gap between cruelty and compassion.
Precisely. Which leads to his final, powerful, defining statement about human potential, what he calls the ultimate unmasking.
Which is?
It's the chilling, yet ultimately hopeful truth about humanity's capacity for choice. Man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright, with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Yisrael on his lips.
That quote, it captures everything. The capacity for ultimate evil and the capacity for ultimate meaning and dignity existing side by side, determined by choice.
That's the core message. Our inner freedom, our ability to choose our attitude and find meaning can never be taken away, no matter the external circumstances.
This has been an incredibly intense, but I think necessary, deep dive. We've gone from the raw hell of the camps, Frankel's observations of human nature under duress,
To the sophisticated, hopeful therapeutic framework of logotherapy that he built upon that brutal foundation.
and the central lesson, it feels incredibly relevant right now, doesn't it? This idea that our core freedom is choosing our response, that life always has potential meaning if we take the responsibility to find it.
Absolutely. We need to stop asking, what can I expect from life?
Mhm.
And start asking, what does life expect from me? What task is waiting for me to fulfill?
So we want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought from Frankel himself. It comes from a discussion technique he used called logodrama.
Right. He posed a question to his therapy group. Imagine an ape, he said, subjected to painful experiments for, say, developing a polio vaccine. Could that ape ever possibly understand the meaning or purpose of its suffering?
The answer is obviously no. An
No.
ape's intelligence can't grasp the human dimension where that suffering might find its justification in saving lives.
Exactly. And then Frankel posed the ultimate question to the group, and by extension to all of us. Are we absolutely sure that the human world is the final, highest dimension of meaning? Is it not conceivable, he asked, that there exists another dimension beyond our own? A super meaning, as he tentatively called it. A dimension where the ultimate question of our own suffering, the suffering that seems senseless to us, finds its complete and unconditional answer, even if it's beyond our finite logical grasp right now.
That idea, that meaning might always be there waiting to be discovered, perhaps on a level we can't even comprehend yet. That feels like the ultimate expression of tragic optimism.
It does indeed.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.